And as for the woman, now that she had been set free, she knew she had to act. The quiet resolve in her eyes as she walked away was the first sign that she wasn't just going to let this go. The officers thought they had broken her, that they had silenced her. But they couldn't have been more wrong. Her husband was coming, and he was bringing with him more power than they could have ever imagined. What would happen when the FBI director found out what happened to his wife? What kind of consequences would those officers face when the full extent of their actions came to light? And most importantly, would they be able to escape the wrath of a man who held the keys to their entire future? Stay tuned, because the next part of the story is going to leave you on the edge of your seat as we unravel the terrifying consequences of what happens when you mess with the wrong person. The truth, when it finally comes to light, is going to shake the very foundations of everything these officers thought they knew about power, justice, and retribution. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The hours that followed were tense, and the silence that hung in the air was deafening. The officers stood in their patrol car, trying to process what had just occurred. They had tied the woman to the tree. They had humiliated her, mocked her, and treated her as though she was nothing more than a target, something to be used for their amusement. But now, as the adrenaline started to fade, the gravity of what they had done began to settle in. What had started as a cruel joke was quickly morphing into something far darker, something they were starting to realize they might not be able to escape. They knew they had crossed a line, but the full weight of their mistake hadn't quite hit them yet. They sat in the car, the engine idling in the background, exchanging nervous glances. One of the officers, a man named Greg, was the first to speak up. "What do you think?" She seemed different, like there was something about her that wasn't normal. His partner, Officer Mark, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had been the one to come up with the idea to detain her, to show her who was in charge. But now, in the quiet aftermath, he was starting to doubt the wisdom of that choice. "I don't know, man. She didn't seem scared like the others. She was calm, almost too calm. There was something off about her, but I still don't get it. Why did she scream like that? Who is she really?" Greg frowned. "I don't know, but there's something we missed. I can't shake the feeling that she wasn't just some random woman, you know." The unease in their voices was palpable. They were both starting to feel the weight of their actions, but neither one knew exactly what to do next. They had humiliated her, sure, but they hadn't considered what might happen afterward. They hadn't anticipated the storm that was now gathering on the horizon. Meanwhile, the woman, whose name was Maria, was walking away from the scene, her body still shaking with adrenaline, but her mind was already racing. She had been through far worse than this in her life, but this was different. This wasn't just about her. This was about her husband, the FBI director, the man who held unimaginable power. And when he found out what had happened to her, things would change. The officers, for all their bravado, had no idea what kind of trouble they had just stirred up. Maria's mind was sharp, calculating. She knew that the time to act was coming soon, but she had to be careful. She couldn't just go straight to her husband with this. There were too many factors at play, too many things that could go wrong. She had to be strategic, and above all, she had to make sure she wasn't seen as the victim here. That wasn't going to work. She was far from helpless, and she needed to show that to the world. As she made her way back home, Maria's thoughts turned to her husband, Daniel. He had been the FBI director for over a decade now, one of the most powerful men in the country. A man who knew secrets that could ruin careers, destroy lives, and shift the balance of power. He was a force to be reckoned with, but even more importantly, he loved her. And when he found out what those officers had done, he wouldn't hesitate to take action. That was the part that terrified them. Daniel was a man of integrity, a man who believed in justice above all else. But he was also a man who knew the cost of being an enemy of the system. His enemies had tried to take him down before, but they had underestimated him. They had underestimated the lengths he would go to protect what was his. And now these officers, these men who thought they could have fun at his wife's expense, were about to learn the hard way that they had made a grave mistake. Maria arrived home, and as she stepped inside, the weight of the situation hit her. She couldn't go to Daniel yet. She had to gather all the facts, make sure she understood exactly what had happened before involving him. She knew how powerful he was, but she also knew that once he got involved, there would be no going back. This wasn't just a matter of police brutality. This was a matter of revenge, a matter of showing those officers that they couldn't get away with it. And when Daniel found out, he wouldn't stop until they paid for what they had done. As Maria sat in the quiet of their home, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone ringing. She glanced at the caller ID and saw that it was Daniel. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't told him yet, but somehow she knew he would find out soon enough. "Hey, babe," she said, trying to sound calm, though her voice betrayed a hint of tension. "What's up?" There was a pause on the other end of the line before Daniel spoke, his voice low and measured. "Maria, I need you to listen to me. Something's going on. I've been hearing rumors. Something's happening with the department. Is everything okay?" Maria's pulse quickened. She hadn't said anything about what had happened yet, but somehow Daniel had picked up on it. He always did. "I'm fine," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Everything's fine. But we need to talk. There's something I need to tell you." Daniel's tone shifted, his voice becoming more insistent. "What is it, Maria? Are you in trouble?" She sighed, knowing there was no way to avoid it any longer. "It's not about me. It's about some officers, some white cops who, they tied me up. To a tree, for fun. I tried to get away, but they didn't care." There was silence on the other end of the line for a moment before Daniel spoke again, his voice colder now, more controlled. "Where are they? What happened to them?" Maria hesitated, feeling a pang of guilt. She knew Daniel's temper, his sense of justice. If she told him everything, he would go after those officers. She needed to make sure she was in control of the situation, that it didn't escalate too quickly. "I'm not sure. They were just doing their job, I think. But you know how things can get." "I'm fine, Daniel. I'm just shaken." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his mind racing as he processed the information. "Listen to me, Maria. Don't do anything. I'll take care of this. We'll get to the bottom of it, but I need you to stay calm. Don't make any decisions without me, okay?" Maria nodded, though Daniel couldn't see her. "Okay, I'll wait for you." The conversation ended, and Maria sat in the silence of their home, staring out the window. She knew the storm was coming. She knew that the officers would soon feel the full weight of what they had done. And when it all came crashing down, nothing would ever be the same again. The following days were filled with a quiet kind of tension that weighed heavily on Maria. Though her husband, Daniel, had promised to handle things, she couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was slipping out of her control. She had tried to keep herself busy, to distract her mind from what had happened. But the memories of that afternoon kept creeping back into her thoughts, uninvited. The cruel smirks of those officers, the way they humiliated her, it all felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. And every time she closed her eyes, it was as though the images of her shackled wrists, the pain in her chest, were burned into her mind. Maria sat in the quiet of their home, staring at the phone in her hand. She'd been avoiding calls, trying to gather her thoughts before reaching out to anyone else. She wasn't ready to tell anyone else what had happened, not yet. She wasn't ready to let the world in on the vulnerability she felt. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the officers who thought they could get away with treating her like an object, like a plaything for their amusement. It was about them learning the hard way that they couldn't mess with people like her, people who had more power than they could even imagine. But more than anything, it was about Daniel, the man who had devoted his life to upholding the law, the man who worked tirelessly to bring justice to those who had none. She knew what he was capable of, and that knowledge both comforted and terrified her. She had seen his power in action before, but she also knew that this situation was different. It wasn't just about doing what was right anymore. It was personal. And when things got personal for Daniel, nothing was ever the same. Meanwhile, across town, the officers who had been responsible for what happened to Maria were trying to pretend like nothing had changed. Greg and Mark had gone on with their patrols, trying to bury the guilt that had started to gnaw at them. They'd laughed about the whole incident at first, dismissed it as a harmless prank. But now, in the stillness of their downtime, the gravity of what they had done began to set in. Greg couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the image of Maria's face in his mind, the calm, eerie way she had looked at them before she was set free. There was something about her that didn't sit right with him, something that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just that she was a woman of color, or that they had tied her up. It was the way she carried herself afterward, the way she seemed to hold a quiet power, like she wasn't afraid of them, like she wasn't afraid of anything. Mark, on the other hand, had been trying to block it out, to pretend like it hadn't happened. But deep down, he couldn't stop thinking about what Greg had said. There was something different about Maria. She wasn't just another person they could push around. And the more he thought about it, the more uneasy he became. He hadn't realized it at the time, but they had made a dangerous enemy. The question was, who was she really? And why had she reacted the way she did? The officers were far from realizing the depth of their mistake. They didn't know that Maria wasn't just anyone. They didn't know that she wasn't someone who would let something like this slide. And they certainly had no idea that her husband wasn't just some ordinary man. They didn't know that the man who was married to Maria was the FBI director, and that once Daniel found out what had happened, their lives would never be the same. Back at home, Maria was growing restless. She could feel the pressure building, a storm gathering in the distance. She knew Daniel would take action, but she also knew it would take time. And in that time, the officers might be doing their best to cover their tracks, to justify what they had done. It was all too easy for people like them to pretend like nothing had happened. But Maria wasn't about to let that happen. She wasn't about to be swept under the rug like so many others before her. The more she thought about it, the more Maria realized that this wasn't just about getting back at the officers for their cruelty. It wasn't even about revenge, not really. It was about sending a message. It was about showing the world that people like them couldn't be allowed to get away with this kind of behavior. That when someone with power, real power, was wronged, the consequences would be swift and unforgiving. Maria had already started putting her plan into motion. She knew she had to keep a low profile, at least for now. But she also knew that she couldn't let the officers get comfortable. She needed to make sure they were always looking over their shoulders, wondering when the storm would hit. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the best way to do that was to make them feel the fear she had felt. Make them see how easy it was to become the prey. A few days later, Daniel came home. Maria could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of the world on his shoulders. He didn't ask her about what had happened. He didn't need to. He knew her well enough to see that she was still carrying the burden of what had occurred. But there was something else in his eyes, something darker, something colder. Maria knew that whatever happened next, things would never be the same. As they sat together that evening, Daniel spoke quietly. "I've already started looking into it. You don't have to worry. We'll take care of it." Maria nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settle in her chest. She had no doubt that Daniel would do everything in his power to make sure the officers paid for what they had done. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something they hadn't uncovered yet. She didn't trust the officers to just lay low. And she didn't trust that the system would protect her the way Daniel believed it would. There were too many forces at play, too many people with their own agendas. She couldn't let herself become a pawn in someone else's game. The next day, as Maria walked through the city, she couldn't help but feel like the walls were closing in around her. She knew the officers were still out there, probably trying to cover their tracks. But she also knew that, sooner or later, the truth would come to light. And when it did, it would change everything. The tension between the officers, Maria, and Daniel continued to grow, each side unaware of the other's movements. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but there were still too many unanswered questions. And as the days passed, the clock was ticking, and everyone involved knew that something big was about to happen. But what? And when? That was the question hanging in the air, just out of reach, waiting to be answered. The story was far from over. The first act had only just begun. Days turned into weeks, and the unease that had settled in Maria's chest only grew heavier with each passing moment. Though Daniel was doing everything he could to find out who the officers were and what had led them to target her, she felt the darkness creeping closer, the weight of the unknown pressing on her. She had already prepared herself for what was to come, but the longer things dragged on, the more uncertain she became about how much she could control. Greg and Mark, too, were beginning to feel the strain. The weight of what had happened to Maria was becoming harder to ignore. Greg had even started having nightmares, seeing her eyes staring back at him, accusing and calm, from the moments before they let her go. Mark, once certain they had simply made a mistake, had begun to feel the chill of doubt. There were whispers in the department about them, suspicions about what they'd done, and rumors that were beginning to spread faster than they could manage. One late night, while they were on patrol, Greg spoke up. "You know, I can't stop thinking about her. Something's not right with this, Mark. We messed up big time. She's not some random woman we can just forget about." Mark scowled, glancing out at the empty streets. "I know, but what can we do now? We're already in it, and we can't go back. Let's just lay low, keep our heads down. There's no way she's going to come after us." But deep down, Mark wasn't so sure. There was something about the way Maria had held herself, something unshakable in her presence, that made him feel like they had stepped into something much bigger than they had ever expected. He wasn't sure how, but somehow he knew that they were being watched. Back at Maria's home, the tension was unbearable. She could feel it, too, the silence that stretched between her and Daniel, the quiet understanding that things were changing. Daniel had spent hours poring over reports, tracking down information, following leads. But every time they got close to something concrete, the trail would go cold, the evidence would vanish. It was as though someone was pulling strings from the shadows, making sure that no one would be held accountable. Maria watched her husband, saw the frustration in his eyes, and knew he was reaching his breaking point. He had devoted his life to justice, to making sure that wrongs were righted. But this was different. This was personal. And in the world of law and power, personal vendettas had a way of twisting everything into something unrecognizable. One evening, after another fruitless day of searching for answers, Maria and Daniel sat down in the living room. The dim light cast shadows on the walls, adding to the weight of the conversation that hung in the air. "I've got a plan," Daniel said, his voice colder than usual. "But we need to act fast. If we don't, we risk losing everything." Maria looked up at him, her gaze sharp. "What do you mean, lose everything? What kind of plan are we talking about?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion clouding his face. "I'm talking about making sure those officers don't walk away from this. But I need to know if you're ready for what comes next. This isn't just about them anymore. This is bigger than us." Maria leaned forward, her heart pounding. "I've been ready. You know I've been ready for this. Whatever happens, we need to make sure they pay for what they did." Daniel's eyes hardened, his jaw clenching. "Then it's time to go all in. We'll get them, but we need to make sure we're the ones calling the shots. No one else can get in the way." Maria nodded, feeling a chill run down her spine. It wasn't just about righting a wrong anymore. It was about sending a message that no one, not even those who believed they were untouchable, could escape the consequences of their actions. Meanwhile, Greg and Mark were starting to feel the pressure of the investigation closing in around them. They had hoped that, by now, the situation would have blown over, that people would forget about that day. But things weren't going as planned. They were being questioned by their superiors, their every move watched with suspicion. They had no idea that their actions had set off a chain of events that would soon come back to haunt them. And as their lives began to unravel, they started hearing whispers. Whispers that someone powerful, was coming after them. They didn't know who or why, but the fear that had been creeping into their minds began to take hold. The pressure was building, and the walls were closing in. Maria knew it was time. She had done what she could to gather information, to make sure Daniel's plan was in place. But now it was no longer about strategy. It was about waiting for the right moment to strike. The tension between the two sides, Maria and Daniel, the officers, was thick in the air. Everyone involved could feel the storm brewing, the quiet before the inevitable clash. Maria, ever the strategist, had done everything to prepare. She knew the risks, the potential fallout. But she also knew that in this game, there were no guarantees. There was no certainty, no easy way out. All she could do was wait to see who would make the first move. The final confrontation loomed, but no one knew when it would happen or how it would play out. One thing was clear, though, when the dust settled, nothing would ever be the same. But deep down, Greg knew that something had shifted. They were in too deep now, and there was no way out. Meanwhile, the mysterious voice from the phone call was still haunting Daniel. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the person who had called wasn't just trying to threaten him. They were trying to manipulate him, pull him into a game he didn't fully understand. It was as if the pieces of a chessboard were shifting around him, and he was just a pawn, unaware of the true players who had set the board in motion. Daniel felt the urgency of the situation. He needed to act quickly. Maria's safety was on his mind now more than ever. He couldn't let this spiral out of control, couldn't let whatever shadowy force was behind this have the last word. He turned to Maria, his face grave. "I don't know who's behind this yet, but I'm going to find out. I'm not going to let them use us as pawns in their game. I'll protect you, Maria. We'll make sure they understand who they're messing with." Maria nodded, but there was an unease in her that even Daniel couldn't ignore. The unknown was a powerful enemy, and though they had been careful, she could feel the walls closing in. She wasn't sure how much more they could take before everything exploded. The tension in the air was suffocating. Both sides, Maria and Daniel, and Greg and Mark, were being pulled into a game that none of them fully understood. The mystery was deepening, and every step forward felt like they were falling deeper into a trap. And as the clock ticked closer to whatever confrontation was inevitable, it became clearer than ever that this wasn't just about retribution. It was about exposing the darkness lurking beneath the surface. But the biggest question remained: who was orchestrating it all? And what would be the final cost? The tension that had been building for weeks finally reached its breaking point. Daniel knew the time had come to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows, and he was prepared to put everything on the line. With Maria by his side, they had gathered what they could, piecing together the puzzle that had eluded them for so long. But even as they closed in on the truth, it felt as though they were walking into a storm they couldn't control. It was a late evening when Daniel received the call, another unknown number. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the phone, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Are you ready, Director?" the voice on the other end asked, smooth and measured. "You've been digging for answers, but what if the truth isn't something you can handle?" Daniel's heart raced. This wasn't just a warning, it was a challenge. He didn't respond immediately, his mind quickly processing the possibilities. "We know what you've been doing," the voice continued. "The officers, the investigation, it's all been part of a much bigger plan. But I have one final piece of the puzzle for you." Before Daniel could speak, the line went dead. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Maria turned to him, her face pale. "What do we do now?" "We confront it," Daniel said, his voice hard with determination. "Whatever this is, it ends tonight." Together, they set their plan into motion. They knew where Greg and Mark were meeting with their mysterious backers, the powerful individuals who had been pulling the strings from the very beginning. Daniel had gotten a tip, an anonymous source who had given them the final piece of the puzzle. The officers weren't just acting on their own. They had been part of a much larger network of corruption and power. And now it was time to expose everything. The meeting location was a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place that seemed to breathe secrecy. As Daniel and Maria approached, the weight of what they were about to do pressed heavily on their shoulders. Every instinct screamed that this could end badly, but they had no choice now. The people behind the officers were far more dangerous than they could have imagined. And this confrontation wasn't just about retribution. It was about stopping something much bigger from unfolding. They crept through the shadows, staying low, keeping their breathing steady. Daniel's hand was steady on his gun, but his mind was racing. Who were these people, and what had they done to ensure their survival all these years? As they neared the warehouse, they heard voices inside. Low, hushed conversations. Daniel signaled to Maria to stay close as they approached the building, making sure they wouldn't be seen. They peered through a crack in the door and saw Greg and Mark, standing in front of a table. But it wasn't just them. Seated at the table were several figures, faces half hidden in the darkness, their eyes cold and calculating. One of them leaned forward, speaking in a voice that was too familiar. "You think you can just walk away from this, don't you? You've done your part, but there's no going back now." Daniel's blood ran cold. That voice, it was one he recognized. A voice he had heard in the background of several high-profile cases over the years. The truth was starting to unfold in a way he hadn't expected. Before he could react, a sharp noise broke the stillness, a car approaching fast. Daniel's heart stopped as he realized they had been compromised. The doors of the warehouse swung open, and a group of armed men stepped inside. Their leader was none other than the man Daniel had been chasing all this time, the one who had orchestrated everything from behind the scenes. It was then that the truth hit like a ton of bricks. The entire web of corruption, the officers, the cover-ups, they had all been part of a larger operation, one that reached far deeper into the system than Daniel could have imagined. The man standing before them was none other than the very person who had been secretly pulling the strings for years. someone at the very top of the government, a shadowy figure who had been hiding in plain sight. Daniel's mind raced as he processed the revelation. He knew he had to act fast, or it would all spiral out of control. But before he could move, the man spoke again, his words like a cold dagger. "You think you can stop this? You're too late, Director. This is bigger than you, bigger than any of us. You and your wife." He paused, a chilling smile crossing his face. "You're just pawns in this game." But Daniel wasn't done yet. Without hesitation, he drew his gun, his voice cold. "I don't care how big your game is. This ends tonight." The standoff was brief but intense. Shots rang out, and chaos erupted in an instant. In the confusion, Greg and Mark scrambled for cover, realizing they were caught in something they couldn't control. But just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, a new player entered the scene, someone Daniel hadn't expected. Maria, moving with a speed and precision that took everyone by surprise, fired a shot that incapacitated the leader of the operation. In that moment, everything changed. The entire room fell into stunned silence. But as the dust settled, Daniel felt a strange unease wash over him. They had won the battle, yes, but the war was far from over. The final twist came as the authorities arrived on the scene. Maria's eyes widened in disbelief when she saw the officer leading the charge, none other than the very person who had orchestrated the original attack on her. The betrayal was too much to comprehend. It was only then that Daniel realized the truth. The corruption ran deeper than he could have ever imagined. And the fight wasn't just about stopping one man or one group. It was about exposing a system that had been rigged for years. And as they looked around the room, the weight of that knowledge settled in. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The dust from the confrontation in the warehouse still lingered in the air as Daniel stood at the center of the chaos. The armed men had been disarmed, the shadowy figures from the dark corners of the system now lying incapacitated on the cold concrete floor. But the victory felt hollow, as if something more crucial was left unaddressed. The authorities had arrived, led by the officer who had once been a trusted ally, now revealed to be part of the very network Daniel had fought to expose. It was the final betrayal, and as Maria's eyes met his, he could feel the weight of the realization settle in. This wasn't just about stopping a few bad apples. It was about taking down an entire system of corruption that had wormed its way into the heart of the nation. The officer who had entered the scene, the one who had once worked alongside Daniel, now stood facing them, his hands shaking as he surveyed the damage. His expression was one of resignation, as if he knew the truth had already been uncovered, and there was no way to undo what had been done. "You think you've won?" The officer sneered, though there was no conviction in his voice. "You don't understand. This was never just about a couple of cops. This is bigger than anything you can imagine." Daniel stepped forward, his gaze hardening. "I understand more than you think. You were a part of something that goes deeper than we ever realized, but it ends tonight. The truth is out. You're done." For a moment, the officer's face flickered with uncertainty, but then it was gone, replaced by a grim, almost defeated smile. "You think taking us down changes anything? The system is broken, Director. You can expose all you want, but it's too late for any of us. The corruption runs too deep." Maria's voice broke through the tension. "It's never too late. We have to stand up, even when it feels like the fight is too big. Otherwise, what's the point?" Daniel turned to her, feeling a wave of pride wash over him. He had never realized just how much strength Maria possessed until moments like these, when everything seemed impossible, and she still found a way to push forward. Together, they had uncovered the truth, and together they would see it through. The fight wasn't just about them anymore. It was about making sure the system that allowed this to happen could no longer operate in the shadows. As the authorities moved in, the officer was arrested, but Daniel knew the battle was far from over. The web of corruption that had ensnared so many had yet to be fully unraveled. It would take time, but the tide was shifting. The truth had a way of finding the light, and it couldn't be hidden anymore. In the days that followed, the story broke wide open. News outlets reported on the vast network of corruption that had existed within law enforcement and beyond. The names of those involved were revealed, and the public was outraged. But even more shocking was the role of the man who had been pulling the strings, the shadowy figure who had been orchestrating the entire operation from the top. His arrest sent shockwaves through the system, but it also opened the floodgates for deeper investigations. Daniel and Maria's courage to stand up and expose the truth had sparked a movement. They weren't just heroes for their personal fight. They had become symbols of resistance against a broken system. Maria stood by Daniel as the media attention started to shift from the shocking discovery to the impact of their actions. While the world watched with bated breath, Daniel couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them here. The fear they had felt when Maria was first attacked, the doubt that had crept in during their investigation, the betrayal that had almost broken them, it had all led to this moment. They had never expected to be at the center of such a monumental shift, but they had done it together. They had uncovered the truth, and now it was time to see it through. As the weeks passed, the system began to change, slowly but surely. Reforms were put in place, new leadership was introduced, and for the first time in years, there was hope that things could get better. The fight was far from over. There would always be more battles to face, more darkness to confront. But Daniel and Maria knew that as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came next. In the quiet moments, when the world outside seemed to calm down, Daniel and Maria found solace in the simple things. They walked together, hand in hand, through the streets of their neighborhood, knowing that their lives would never be the same again. They had seen the worst of humanity, but they had also seen the best, the resilience of people willing to fight for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. Daniel knew that this victory wasn't just theirs. It was for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. For everyone who had ever stood up and spoken the truth, no matter the cost. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were ready. Together, they would continue to expose the darkness, to hold those in power accountable, and to fight for a world where justice wasn't just a word, it was a reality. And as they walked into the future, hand in hand, Daniel couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. They had won. The truth had triumphed, and in that moment, nothing else seemed more important than knowing they had done what was right. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, and though the road ahead was uncertain, they were no longer alone in the fight. They had sparked a change, and the world would never be the same. Imagine a quiet afternoon, the air crisp with the scent of pine trees. You're walking through a secluded forest, surrounded by towering oaks, with nothing but the occasional bird call breaking the silence. But what if in the midst of that peace, something disturbing happened? Something that shook the very foundation of trust between people and those sworn to protect them. This is the story of a moment when two white police officers crossed a line they never thought they'd cross, all for a cruel sense of power. They had no idea who they were messing with. No idea that the woman they thought was just another victim in a small town would turn out to be someone with ties to an unimaginable force. This isn't just another story of police misconduct. This is a story about assumptions, mistakes, and consequences. It's about a Black woman bound to a tree, screaming for mercy. It's about the officers who thought it would be a laugh, a simple act of cruelty, a way to assert their dominance. What they didn't know was that the woman they tied up, The one they laughed at as she struggled in fear was not just anyone. She wasn't just another person they could push around in their small town. She was someone much bigger, much more powerful than they could have ever imagined. Let's go back to that moment. The officers, standing there with smirks on their faces, enjoying the sight of a helpless woman tied to a tree, felt a rush of satisfaction. The woman, her hands cuffed behind her body trembling with fear, didn't say a word at first. She just stared at them, her eyes burning with a quiet fury. They had no idea who she was, no idea the kind of power she held in her life. To them, she was just another black woman, another victim in the long history of people they thought they could control. But that couldn't have been further from the truth. You see, this wasn't just any woman. She was the wife of someone who had the power to bring down entire systems. A man who had connections that could expose every dark secret the officers tried to hide. She wasn't just the wife of a businessman or a lawyer or even a politician. She was married to someone who held the highest authority. She was married to the FBI director. As the officers stood there, laughing, unaware of the dangerous game they were playing, they couldn't see the storm that was about to hit them. The woman, trembling but determined, could already feel the weight of what was about to unfold. This wasn't just going to be another terrible story of abuse. No, this was going to be something that would shake the very core of law enforcement, something that would bring the spotlight onto their actions in a way they never imagined. And it would all start with a woman tied to that tree. The moment she was finally freed, after what seemed like hours of torment, was the moment they knew they had made a huge mistake. They had gone too far. They had no idea who they had wronged, but they were about to learn the hard way. Because in that moment, as they watched her walk away, they had no idea that her husband was already on his way, and when he arrived, there would be no escaping the consequences. The officers had no way of knowing the level of power and reach the FBI director had. They thought they were untouchable, that they were in control of the situation. But they were wrong. The world was about to come crashing down on them, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. What happens next? How does someone go from being a victim to becoming the cause of a huge scandal, one that could destroy careers, ruin lives, and change everything? How does the FBI director respond to what has happened to his wife? The answers to these questions are more complicated than you might think, and they lead to an unexpected twist that will leave you stunned. But before we get into that, we have to understand the context of what led to this moment. What kind of officers would do something like this? How could they think this would go unpunished? And why did they choose to target her in the first place? To answer these questions, we need to look deeper into their pasts, their motivations, and the reasons behind their actions. The two officers weren't just acting on a whim. They weren't just pulling over the wrong person at the wrong time. No, there was something more. There were layers to their behavior, something that made them believe they could get away with this. And as we dig deeper into their pasts, we'll uncover secrets that could explain why they thought this was acceptable. But those secrets, once revealed, would set off a chain reaction that would forever change their lives.